The entire auction room went quiet the moment the violin case was opened. Not the polite, reverent quiet that settles over a crowd before a performance. This was the other kind. The kind that happens when something goes wrong, and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. The case had been carried in by two white-gloved assistants from Hartwell's auction house in Toronto. Treated with the careful ceremony, usually reserved for objects worth $500,000. Because that was exactly what they believed it was worth. A 1723 Guarneri del Gesù violin, one of fewer than 150 known to exist in the world, consigned by the estate of the late concert violinist Marguerite Fontenay. The auction catalogue had described it as, arguably the finest stringed instrument to pass through Canadian hands in a generation. The woman standing nearest to the display table was Sylviane Ouella, president of the Montreal Philharmonic Foundation and the expected buyer. She had flown in from Montreal that morning. She did not reach out to touch the violin. She simply looked at it, and then looked at her appraiser, and the appraiser gave a small, almost invisible shake of his head. Across the room, the auction house manager began whispering urgently into his phone. Nobody paid attention to the man, standing near the back wall. He was holding a paper coffee cup from the Tim Hortons 2 blocks away. His jacket was the kind bought for function, rather than appearance. Waterproof, worn at the elbows, with a pocket that had been restitched at some point with thread that didn't quite match. His name was Fletcher Dodd, and he was 43 years old, and he had driven 4 hours from a small workshop in Kingston, Ontario, because someone had sent him a photograph of the violin 3 days earlier, and he had not been able to stop thinking about it since. He had not been invited. He heard about the auction, the way he heard about most things, through a network of instrument restorers and luthiers, who passed information around the way. People in other professions passed around job listings. A colleague in Ottawa had forwarded him the listing with a single line attached. Thought you'd want to see this. Looks wrong to me too. Fletcher finished his coffee, set the cup quietly on a side table near the fire exit, and waited. The room had begun to murmur. The appraiser from the Montreal Foundation was now speaking in a low voice to the lead auctioneer, gesturing toward the instrument without touching it. Someone near the front pulled out a phone and began photographing the violin from several angles. The woman who had brought it in, a representative of the Fontenay estate, young, visibly uncomfortable, stood to one side, clasping her hands. The varnish degradation alone suggests this instrument hasn't been properly stored in years, the appraiser was saying, loudly enough now that the room could hear him. And this crack along the lower bout, that's not recent damage. That's structural. You'd be looking at a complete restoration before it could ever be played again. If it can be restored at all. It can't, said another voice. A dealer from Vancouver who had built a reputation for definitive pronouncements. I've seen this before. The top plate has shifted. The bass bar is almost certainly compromised. You'd be taking it apart completely and rebuilding it from the inside, and with an instrument this old, that kind of intervention changes what it is. Frankly, it stops being a Guarneri and becomes an expensive reconstruction. He paused to let that land. My recommendation? The estate should withdraw the lot. This isn't what they thought they had. Sylviane Ouella nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've already decided. Fletcher had worked his way to the edge of the display table by then. He wasn't pushing, he simply moved into the spaces. People left as they stepped back, and people had been stepping back steadily for the last few minutes. He looked at the violin for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, I think this can be brought back. The Vancouver dealer turned to look at him. I'm sorry, who are you? Fletcher Dodd. I restore instruments, mostly strings, mostly historic. The dealer's expression shifted into something polite and unconvinced. Do you have a card? Fletcher patted his jacket pockets and found that he did not in fact have a card. He had not brought business cards to an auction he had not been invited to. I have a website, he said. Someone in the room laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, more the nervous release of tension in a situation that had become awkward. But it carried across the room, and Fletcher heard it, and kept looking at the violin. What happened next, in a city like Toronto, would not have seemed particularly important. A man had offered an opinion at an auction. The opinion had been politely ignored. These things happened constantly in the world of antique instruments. Everyone was an expert, no one agreed, and the objects themselves waited in their cases while human beings argued about them. But the woman from the Fontenay estate was standing close enough to have heard Fletcher speak, and something in the way he said it, not the words themselves but the quality of certainty behind them, unhurried and unperforming, made her turn toward him instead of away. Her name was Isabelle Fontenay. She was 28 years old, and had inherited responsibility for her grandmother's estate 6 months earlier, at a moment in her life when she had not been prepared for it. Her grandmother Marguerite had been a celebrated violinist, who performed across Europe and North America for 4 decades. Before her death the previous spring. The violin in the case had been Marguerite's primary instrument for 31 of those years. It was not simply a valuable object, it was the thing her grandmother had loved most completely, and Isabelle had grown up watching her play it, at family gatherings in the house outside Quebec City, in the long evenings when guests had gone home, and Marguerite would sit by the window and play, simply because she wanted to. The estate lawyers had recommended selling it. The instrument needed professional care that the estate could not provide, they said, and keeping it would only accelerate whatever deterioration had already begun. Isabelle had agreed, reluctantly, trusting that the auction house knew what they were doing, that the process would be handled with care. Now she was standing in a room full of people, deciding that the thing her grandmother loved was worthless, and she did not know what to do with that. She crossed the room to Fletcher. "You said you think it can be brought back," she said. "What does that mean exactly?" Fletcher looked at her. "It means the instrument isn't dead, it's sick." "There's a difference," the other man said. "Restoring it would make it something else." "He's not entirely wrong," Fletcher said. "Aggressive restoration on a Guarneri can compromise what makes it what it is. But what I'm seizing here isn't a case for aggressive restoration. The top has shifted, yes. The bass bar needs attention, but the fundamental architecture of this instrument is still intact. Whoever made this, and I believe this is what the estate believes it is, built it with an internal logic that doesn't disappear just because the outer condition has deteriorated. If you take it apart carefully, if you understand what you're looking at before you touch anything, you can address the structural issues without changing its essential character." He said it the same way he had said everything else, simply, without performance. "How long would that take?" Isabelle asked. "Depending on what I find when I open it, 4 months. Maybe 5. And if you're wrong, if it turns out the damage is worse than it looks?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "Then you'll know exactly what's wrong with it instead of guessing. That's worth something by itself." Isabelle looked at the violin for a long time. Then she looked at Fletcher. "Everyone in this room thinks you're wrong," she said. "I know. That doesn't concern you?" "It concerns me less than leaving this instrument in a case while people argue about whether it's worth saving." She made the decision standing right there, which surprised her afterward. She was not someone who made decisions quickly. She was a civil engineer, trained to model outcomes, to account for variables, to build structures that would not fail. But something about the conversation felt like solid ground, and she stepped onto it. "All right," she said. "Come to Kingston. Show me your workshop." Fletcher Dodd had been repairing stringed instruments for 19 years, out of a converted boathouse on the edge of the Cataraqui River, that he had spent 3 summers making functional. The workspace smelled of hide glue and spruce shavings and, faintly, of the river. The walls held tools he had made himself, tools inherited from his former teacher, and a long shelf of reference volumes in 4 languages. The light was good. He had installed skylights himself, 6 of them, because light was the most important thing. He lived in the house attached to the workshop with his daughter Penny, who was 9 years old, and whose current primary interest was identifying birds by their calls, which she practiced by listening to recordings on an old tablet in the evenings after dinner. Penny had been 4 when her mother died. Miriam had been a cellist, not a professional one, but a dedicated amateur who had played in a community orchestra in Kingston for 12 years. She died of a brain aneurysm on a Thursday afternoon in February, without warning, while Fletcher was at the workshop, and Penny was at daycare. By the time Fletcher reached the hospital, there was nothing to be done. He did not talk about Miriam often. Not because the grief had diminished. It hadn't, not entirely, not after 5 years. but because language felt inadequate to describe the specific way a person's absence reorganizes every ordinary thing. The workshop that had once been a shared project became his alone. The cello Miriam had played stood in the corner of the living room, because he couldn't bring himself to move it, and couldn't play it himself. Penny had started asking about learning an instrument, and Fletcher was slowly working out how to answer that, without making her feel the weight of what he couldn't say. He cooked dinner every evening. He walked Penny to school when the weather permitted. He maintained a list of migratory birds she had identified so far this year, on the whiteboard in the kitchen. He did the work that was in front of him, because that was what there was to do. When Isabelle Fontenay arrived at the workshop on a gray Wednesday in early November, she arrived with two things: her grandmother's violin in its case, and an expression that Fletcher recognized as the particular combination of hope and bracing for disappointment that people brought when they were trying not to want something too much. She stopped inside the workshop door and looked around for a long moment. "This is not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know, something more industrial." "Industrial would be wrong for this kind of work," Fletcher said. "Everything here is done by hand. If you can't feel what you're doing, you'll miss something." He took the violin case to his work table, and opened it with the same care he always brought to a first examination. Slow, without assumptions, he lifted the instrument out and held it in the light from the skylight, directly above, turning it slowly, not touching anything he didn't need to touch. Penny appeared in the doorway that connected the workshop to the house, having come home from school while they were talking. She looked at the violin and then at Isabelle. "Is that really old?" she asked. "It might be almost 300 years old," Isabelle said. Penny considered this. "Is my dad going to fix it? We're trying to figure that out." Penny nodded and went back inside, and Fletcher heard the sound of the tablet starting up, a birdsong recording, a thrush of some kind, played twice. He teached 2 hours with the violin that afternoon. He used a light source threaded through the F-holes to examine the interior condition. He used calipers to measure the arch height of the top and back plates at 17 points. He mapped the crack along the lower bout with a magnifying glass, tracing its path from one end to the other, noting where it widened and where it held. He took photographs. He was silent for most of it, and Isabelle sat on a stool near the window and watched him work, which she did quietly, which he appreciated. At the end of 2 hours, he set the violin back in its case, and washed his hands at the utility sink. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said. Isabelle looked slightly surprised. "What do you want to know? How she played? What she played? How she stored this instrument? Whether she was still playing it in her last years, or whether it had been sitting?" Isabelle told him. Marguerite had played until she was 79, 2 years before her death. In her final 2 years, arthritis had made it impossible. The violin had been in its case since then. Stored in Marguerite's study, which was climate-controlled, because Marguerite had been meticulous about that. The crack had appeared, as best anyone could determine, during the transport of the estate's contents after she died. A moving company, a cold day, the case had been dropped. Fletcher nodded. "That explains a lot. Is that good? It means the damage has a clear cause and a clear boundary. The instrument wasn't declining. It was injured. That's different. Injured things can often be set right." He told her what he could do. Not what he would promise, but what he believed was possible with careful work and time. He explained the process of opening the top plate, how hide glue, the same type used to build the instrument originally, responded to gentle heat and could be reversed without damage. He explained what he would look for once the interior was accessible. He explained the kind of bass bar replacement that would preserve the acoustic character rather than altering it. He was precise and specific, because vague reassurance would not serve either of them. "This will take until spring," he said. "Possibly late April. I won't rush it." Isabelle was quiet for a moment. "The estate lawyers are going to tell me this is a mistake." "They might be right," Fletcher said. "I can't guarantee the outcome. What I can tell you is that I'll treat this instrument as if it were the most important thing I've ever worked on, because right now, it is." She left the violin with him. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Fletcher by feeling, in some ways, like the most purposeful stretch of time he had spent since Miriam died. He worked on the violin in the mornings. before other commissions demanded his attention. He had developed a habit, in the years since Miriam's death, of beginning each day with the hardest thing. The thing that required the most concentration and the most care. The violin became that thing, and the mornings became very clear. He opened the top plate in the second week of November, working slowly over 2 full days, applying a heated palette knife to the glue joint 1 centimeter at a time. When the plate finally lifted free, he spent a long time simply looking at the interior, the way a doctor might look at imaging results before speaking. The bass bar had separated at one end. The interior block at the lower bout showed signs of the same cold-related stress that had caused the external crack. But the linings were intact. The corner blocks were intact. The back plate was structurally sound. He photographed everything and sent the images to Isabel with a short note, "Better than I expected." Proceeding. She wrote back an hour later, "Thank you for telling me." He found himself telling Penny about the work in the evenings. In the way he sometimes processed complicated things, by explaining them out loud to someone who was genuinely curious, without any stake in the outcome. Penny was a good listener. She asked questions that were sometimes exactly the right questions, and sometimes completely tangential, which Fletcher found useful. "Why does it matter if the bass bar is in the right place?" she asked one evening, looking up from her bird book. "Because the bass bar transmits vibration from the strings through the body of the instrument. If it's positioned wrong, or if it's the wrong size, the instrument sounds like a different instrument. Like if you moved someone's heart to the wrong place." "Yes," Fletcher said. "Like that." Penny went back to her book. He drove to Montreal in January to visit the music library at McGill, where he spent a day reviewing archival photographs of instruments known to have been made in the same period, and by the same maker. He was not trying to confirm the violin's provenance. That was the job of formal authentication. But he was building a picture of what the instrument was supposed to look like. How its maker had solved certain structural problems, what tolerances he had worked within. The more he understood the original intention, the more precisely he could work toward it. He had lunch alone at a counter near the library, and thought about Miriam, who had studied at McGill briefly before transferring to Queen's. He thought about her the way he often thought about her in cities, not with acute grief, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a presence in a room. The bass bar replacement took 3 weeks. He had made the new bar from a piece of close-grained Bavarian spruce that had been drying in his stock for 11 years. Which was roughly what it needed to be. The wood's working properties changed as it aged. And newer spruce would have responded differently under the plane. He fitted the bar by trial and placement, dozens of small adjustments over many sessions, checking the fit with a light source after each change until the contact was continuous and even. He did not find shortcuts. There were no shortcuts in this work, or rather there were shortcuts, and he simply did not use them, because shortcuts in instrument restoration were the kinds of decisions that showed up 40 years later when someone opened the instrument again and found they had inherited someone else's compromised solution. In February, Isabel drove to Kingston to see the progress. He showed her the instrument in its opened state, which was not dramatic to look at. It resembled, at that stage, a shell more than a violin, but he walked her through what had been done, and what remained. She stood at the worktable and listened carefully, asking questions that demonstrated she had been reading about the process since their first meeting. "You've been doing research," he said. "I wanted to understand what you're telling me," she said. "I'm an engineer. I need to understand things structurally before they make sense to me." He showed her the bass bar he had removed, and the new one he had fitted. He explained the difference in their dimensions and why the new one was correct for this instrument. She examined both under the magnifying glass he handed her. "My grandmother used to say this violin had an opinion," Isabel said, still looking through the glass. "That it would resist you if you played it wrong, and open up completely if you played it right." "That's accurate," Fletcher said. "The best instruments respond to the player. The relationship goes both directions." She played it for 31 years. Then she knew it very well. Isabel set down the magnifying glass. She looked at the opened instrument for a moment. And Fletcher recognized the expression on her face. The particular quality of grief that presents as calm. "Because there's nothing else to do with it right now," Because you're standing in someone else's workspace, and the thing you're grieving isn't the kind of thing you can explain to a stranger. He didn't say anything. He just let the moment be what it was. Before she left, Penny appeared again. She had a pattern of appearing when visitors were present, not intrusively, just hovering at the edges of things the way children sometimes do when they find adults interesting. She asked Isabel whether she played music. "Not really," Isabel said. "I always wished I did. My grandmother tried to teach me when I was young, but I didn't have the patience." "My mom played cello," Penny said. "My dad keeps it in the living room." A short silence. "That's a good place for it," Isabel said. Penny nodded and disappeared back inside. Fletcher drove his attention back to the work table. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be," Isabel said. "She sounds like she was wonderful." She was. The top plate went back on in early March. The closing was in some ways the most delicate part of the whole process. The freshly fitted bar, the repaired crack, the cleaned and prepared surfaces, all coming together, in a sequence that had to be right the first time, because hide glue set quickly, and the pressure had to be precisely calibrated and distributed across dozens of small clamps that Fletcher had spent a full afternoon laying out and labeling before the work began. Penny sat in the workshop while he did it, quiet in the way she was when she understood something important was happening. She handed him clamps when he asked, and held a flashlight at one point when he needed both hands occupied and more light at a particular angle. She did not ask questions. When it was done and the clamps were all in place, she said simply, "Good," and he said good, and she went inside. He left the plate clamped for 4 days. When he removed the clamps, the crack was closed. The plate sat flush and even against the ribs. He spent another 3 weeks on the varnish, not repainting, but filling and consolidating the original surface, matching the texture to the surrounding material, preserving as much of the original finish as possible. This was the work that required the most subjective judgment, the most experience in looking at a surface and understanding what it was asking for. And he moved slowly, and did not rush himself. He strung the instrument in early April. He had borrowed a bow from his own collection, a 19th-century Pernambuco bow that he knew and trusted. And he drew it across the strings for the first time in a space that had been silent for weeks. The sound that came out of the violin was rough and unformed, the way all instruments are after long inactivity, the wood needing time to remember how to respond. But underneath the roughness was something that Fletcher had not entirely expected, even though he had hoped for it. The instrument had a voice, not a restored voice, not a facsimile of what it had been, but a genuine voice, three-dimensional and complex, with the particular warmth in the lower register that was the signature of the best instruments from this period. He played a slow scale, then another. The voice opened fractionally with each pass. He set the bow down and stood very still for a moment. Then he went inside and told Penny that the violin was done. Isabel had arranged, through the music faculty at the University of Toronto, for a small private playing session as part of the formal assessment process. Not a public unveiling, not a performance, simply an opportunity for a professional player to handle the restored instrument and provide an evaluation that could be documented. The player she had arranged was a sessional faculty member named Robert Vane, who had performed as a soloist with several Canadian orchestras, and whose technical ear was considered authoritative. The session took place on a Saturday morning in early May, in a rehearsal room at the Faculty of Music on Bloor Street. Fletcher arrived with the violin and its case. Isabel was already there with her estate lawyer, and a colleague from the Montreal Foundation who had come, Fletcher understood, largely out of curiosity. The Vancouver dealer had not been invited. Robert Vane took the violin from Fletcher without ceremony, in the way musicians handle instruments. With natural authority, as if the object knew it was finally in the right hands. He tuned it, tightened the bow, adjusted his position, and played. He played for 20 minutes without stopping. When he finished, the rehearsal room was very quiet. He sat with the violin resting on his knee for a moment before speaking. "This instrument has not lost its character," he said. "That's what I can tell you. Whatever was done here has preserved something essential. The response is immediate, the projection is full, and the lower register has a depth that I've only heard in a handful of instruments in my career." He looked at Fletcher. "What you did here is not common work. I want to be clear about that. Isabel's estate lawyer was writing something in a notebook. The colleague from the Montreal Foundation was looking at the violin with an expression that had changed substantially since the morning. Then Robert set the violin down on his knee and said, "There's something else." He played a passage, a few bars repeated twice, and stopped. "Do you hear that? In the upper register, between the D and E string. There's an overtone here that I don't associate with instruments of this period. It's not a flaw. It's something added, or revealed." He looked at Fletcher again. "Did you do something to the bass bar placement that went beyond standard restoration?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "I fitted the bar to the instrument, rather than to a standard specification. The original bar had been replaced at some point, probably in the early 20th century, and the replacement was slightly out of position. I recalibrated to what I believed the maker's original intention had been, based on archival photographs and structural analysis." Robert looked at the violin. "Well," he said, "whoever built this understood something that we're still figuring out." After the session, Isabel and Fletcher walked out onto Bloor Street into a cool May morning, and Isabel stood on the pavement for a moment without speaking. "She was right," Isabel said finally. "About what?" "My grandmother. She said this violin had a conversation in it. That it wasn't finished telling it yet." She paused. "I thought that was just something she said." Fletcher didn't answer immediately. A streetcar went past on the tracks, the particular rhythm of it. "Sometimes the people closest to something understand it, in ways that are hard to document," he said. Isabel nodded. They stood there for another moment. Then she said, "I want to show you something." She had not told him that the Fontenay estate had been in contact, over the past several weeks, with the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, or that the conversation had been about more than the violin. The NSC had been exploring the creation of a restoration fellowship, funded by private donation, that would support Canadian instrument restorers working on historically significant pieces. The conversation had included, increasingly, the name Fletcher Dodd, whose work on the Fontenay violin had begun to circulate in a small but attentive community of people who cared about these things. Isabel told him this standing on Bloor Street, and then she told him the rest of it. The estate wished to name the fellowship, if it came together, after two people. Marguerite Fontenay, because the violin was hers, and because her life represented what these instruments made possible, and Miriam Dodd, because Isabel had spent several months thinking about what Fletcher had told her in the workshop, about a cello that stood in a living room, and a grief that was still present, and a man who kept doing careful work, because that was what there was to do. "You don't have to say yes," Isabel said. "It's not my decision. The estate and the NACI would need to work that out formally. But I wanted to ask you first." Fletcher looked at the street for a long moment. "Penny's going to have questions," he said. "She sounds like someone who asks good questions." "She does." He paused. "Yes. Tell them yes." The fellowship was announced the following autumn, at a small reception at the NAC. Fletcher drove to Ottawa with Penny, who had dressed herself carefully for the occasion in a way that suggested she had thought about it more than she let on. She stood beside her father through the speeches, watching the room with the focused attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. At one point, during the reception afterward, she tugged Fletcher's sleeve. "Dad, they're going to play the violin." Robert Vane had agreed to perform a short piece at the reception. He was standing at the front of the room now, the restored instrument under his chin, adjusting his position. The first notes filled the room. Fletcher stood very still. He had heard the violin played only twice, during the testing in his workshop, when he had played those slow scales himself, and during Robert's assessment in Toronto. He knew its voice. But hearing it in a room full of people, carried by a player who understood what it was, and what it had come through, was something different. It sounded, he thought, like something that had survived, and was not apologizing for it. Penny stood beside him without moving, looking at the violin. And he recognized on her face the particular quality of attention. That meant she was hearing something that mattered. He recognized it because it was her mother's expression, the one Miriam had worn in concert halls, listening to music she loved, completely present and completely still. He didn't say anything, he just stood beside his daughter and listened. There are people in this world who spend their lives restoring things others have given up on. They work in small spaces, with tools made for patience, on objects that cannot speak for themselves. Most of this work is never seen. Most of the people who do it are never asked to stand at the front of a room, while someone plays what they've saved. But the work gets done anyway, in workshops by rivers, in the hours after children go to sleep, by people who understand that some things are worth the time it takes to bring them back. This is what it looks like when someone refuses to let go of something the world has already decided isn't worth keeping.